My dear friends, I want to invite you into a kitchen in Vermont tonight, where the scent of pot roast mingles with something far more unsettling. The kind of tension that makes a mother's heart race without knowing why. Margaret Collins was setting the table for three when the ceiling above her head suddenly thundered with footsteps, heavy and urgent, like someone running from something they couldn't outrun. Now, Margaret wasn't the type to jump at every sound. After 32 years of teaching high school English in Middlebury, she developed a kind of intuition that could spot trouble from across a crowded hallway. But this sound, this desperate scrambling from her son Daniel's room, sent ice water through her veins. You know that feeling, don't you? When everything seems normal on the surface, but something deep in your gut whispers that your world is about to change forever. She climbed those narrow stairs slowly, each creak of the old wooden steps echoing like a countdown. Margaret had bought this three-bedroom colonial back in 1987 with her late husband Robert, dreaming of grandchildren's laughter filling these halls someday. She'd gotten her wish, though not in the way she'd imagined. Her granddaughter Emma had been living with her for 3 years now, ever since Daniel's wife Sarah lost her battle with cancer. The house had adapted, as houses do, Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator, her textbooks scattered across the kitchen table, her gentle presence bringing life back to rooms that had grown too quiet. But tonight, standing outside Daniel's door, Margaret felt that familiar dread she'd carried since her 40-year-old son moved back home 18 months ago. The unemployment had hit him hard. A skilled IT engineer reduced to delivering groceries and nursing wounded pride with increasingly frequent trips to Murphy's Tavern downtown. Margaret understood financial struggles. She'd stretched her retirement savings to help with Emma's expenses, never once complaining, because that's what grandmothers do. That's what family does. She knocked softly. "Daniel? Everything all right up there?" The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt aggressive. Then came her son's voice, muffled and strange. Just give me a minute, Mom." Margaret pressed her ear to the door and heard something that made her blood run cold. The harsh zip of a suitcase, the rustling of clothes being shoved hastily into bags. Her teaching instincts kicked in, the same ones that helped her navigate thousands of teenage crises over the decades. When someone you love starts packing in secret, they're not planning a surprise vacation. "Danny," she used his childhood nickname, hoping to break through whatever wall he was building. "Dinner's almost ready. Emma's got that presentation tomorrow about renewable energy. You know how excited she's been." The door opened so suddenly Margaret stumbled backward. Daniel stood there, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his face set in lines she didn't recognize. This wasn't her boy, the one who used to build elaborate Lego cities on this very floor, the one who'd cried in her arms when his wife was diagnosed. This was a stranger wearing her son's face, and his eyes held something that made her step back instinctively. "I won't be here for dinner," he said, his voice flat as winter pond ice. "I won't be here for Emma's presentation either." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a house fire. Margaret felt something inside her chest crack. The way lake ice splits in early spring, quietly but completely. "What do you mean you won't be here?" "Daniel, where are you going?" He pushed past her toward the stairs, and she followed, her mind racing through possibilities. A job interview in Burlington? A friend's wedding he'd forgotten to mention? Please, God, let it be something normal, something fixable. But when they reached the living room, Emma looked up from her homework spread across the coffee table, took one look at her father's face, and Margaret watched her granddaughter's expression shift from confusion to understanding to something resembling relief. That broke Margaret's heart more than anything else could have. The realization that this 14-year-old child wasn't surprised by abandonment. "Dad." Emma's voice was small, careful. "Are you leaving again?" Again. The word hit Margaret like a physical blow. How many times had Daniel done this before, slipping away when responsibility got too heavy? How many nights had Emma fallen asleep wondering if her father would be there in the morning? Daniel avoided his daughter's eyes, focusing instead on checking his phone with the nervous energy of a man running from creditors. "I need to start over somewhere. Fresh start, you know? Boston, maybe. There are opportunities there." "What about Emma?" Margaret heard herself ask, though part of her already knew the answer. "She's better off here with you, Mom. You're good with kids, all those years teaching. and Emma's practically raised herself anyway. She doesn't really need me. The cruelty of it took Margaret's breath away, not because it was intentionally vicious. Somehow, that would have been easier to understand. No, this was worse. This was casual dismissal, the kind that came from a man who'd already erased his daughter from his future plans. Emma stood up slowly, her homework forgotten. At 14, she had her mother's quiet dignity and her grandfather's steady gaze. Margaret watched her granddaughter process this betrayal with composure that no child should ever need to develop. "How long will you be gone this time?" Emma asked, and Margaret heard decades of disappointment compressed into those 7 words. Daniel finally looked at his daughter, and for just a moment, Margaret glimpsed the man she'd raised. The boy who'd once insisted on walking her to school every day after she'd sprained her ankle. But then his phone buzzed, and whatever humanity she'd seen vanished behind that wall of selfish determination. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe permanently. Maybe it's time you both learn to get along without me." And with that devastating honesty, Daniel Collins walked out his childhood home, leaving behind his mother's broken heart and his daughter's shattered trust. Margaret heard his car start in the driveway, watched the headlights sweep across the living room wall one last time, and then listened to the sound of her son driving away from the 2 people who loved him most in the world. In the silence that followed, Emma began gathering her homework with mechanical precision, as if organizing her papers could somehow organize the chaos her father had just unleashed. Margaret wanted to say something comforting, something wise, something that would make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Instead, she found herself thinking about pot roast getting cold in the kitchen and wondering how she was going to explain to her granddaughter that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us become the ones we need protection from. Little did Margaret know, as she watched Emma climb the stairs of her room with heartbreaking dignity, that her granddaughter was about to uncover a betrayal so deep, so calculating, that Daniel's abandonment would seem like mercy by comparison. What Margaret didn't know, as she sat alone at her kitchen table picking at cold pot roast that night, was that Emma wasn't upstairs crying into her pillow like most 14-year-olds might. Instead, her granddaughter was doing something far more dangerous. She was thinking. And when a teenager with Emma's particular gift starts thinking about family betrayal stories, well, that's when the real trouble begins. Emma had inherited more than her mother's quiet strength. Sarah Collins had been a financial analyst before cancer changed everything, and she taught her daughter to see patterns where others saw chaos. "Numbers don't lie, sweetheart," she used to say during those last precious months. "People lie, circumstances lie, but numbers? They tell the truth even when no one wants to hear it." Tonight, sitting cross-legged on her bed with her laptop balanced on a stack of textbooks, Emma decided it was time to hear some truth. She'd been suspicious for months, watching her father disappear for entire weekends, claiming job interviews that never seemed to lead anywhere. She'd noticed him on whispered phone calls, seen him quickly close browser windows when she entered the room, watched him check his phone with the nervous energy of someone keeping secrets. Most teenagers would have assumed their parent was having an affair. Emma's analytical mind went somewhere darker. She started with the family's shared bank account, the one her grandmother had put her on as a joint holder when she started babysitting around the neighborhood. Margaret had insisted on it, saying Emma needed to learn financial responsibility. "It's never too early to understand money, honey," she'd said, helping Emma set up online banking. "Your mother would have wanted you to be smart about these things." Emma logged in, expecting to see the usual modest balance that kept their small household running. What she found instead made her stomach drop to the floor. The account was empty. Not low, not overdrawn, completely, impossibly empty. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up transaction histories with the kind of focus intensity she usually reserved for video games or particularly challenging math problems. What she found there painted a picture so shocking, so methodically cruel, that for a moment she couldn't breathe. Over the past 6 months, money had been systematically drained from not just their checking account, but from accounts she didn't even know existed. Her grandmother's retirement savings, the nest egg Margaret had been carefully building for 30 years of teaching, had been liquidated 3 weeks ago. Every penny of it, $127,000, gone. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was a college fund. Emma's college fund had been sacred in their family. Her mother had started the day Emma was born, adding to it religiously even during the worst of the medical bills. After Sarah's death, Margaret had taken over the contributions. Working summer school sessions, she didn't need just to keep building Emma's future. It represented hope, dreams, the promise that education could lift you up no matter what life threw at you. $35,000. Transferred out last Tuesday, the day after Daniel had claimed to be interviewing for a warehouse job in Burlington. Emma sat in the darkness of her room, the laptop screen casting blue light across her face, and felt something she'd never experienced before: pure analytical rage. This wasn't the hot anger of a teenager who'd been denied something she wanted. This was the cold fury of someone who'd just discovered that everything she believed about her family was a lie. She spent the next 4 hours doing what she did best: following digital breadcrumbs. Emma had always been gifted with computers, the way some kids are gifted with music or sports. She understood systems, patterns, the way information flowed through networks like water finding the easiest path downhill. Her teachers had been recommending advanced programming courses since she was 12. Tonight, those skills became weapons. She tracked the money transfers to accounts she'd never seen before, accounts that led to a name that made everything click into place: Sophia Ramirez, Senior Financial Advisor at Boston Capital Management. The same Sophia whose number had been appearing on her father's phone for months. The same Sophia he claimed was just helping with some paperwork when Margaret had asked. But Emma's investigation revealed something far worse than a simple affair. As she dug deeper into Sophia's professional history, cross-referencing state licensing databases with complaint records, a horrifying pattern emerged. Sophia Ramirez wasn't just stealing from the Collins family. She was running what appeared to be a sophisticated elderly fraud protection scheme, except she was the one people needed protecting from. Emma found traces of at least 20 other families, mostly retirees in small Vermont and New Hampshire towns, who'd been systematically drained of their life savings. The amounts were staggering: $45,000 from a retired postal worker in Rutland, $78,000 from a widowed farmer's wife in Lebanon, $92,000 from an elderly couple in White River Junction who'd been saving for their golden anniversary cruise. The method was always the same. Sophia would target adult children who were struggling financially, people like Daniel who had access to their elderly parents' financial information. She'd offer them a partnership opportunity, promising easy money in exchange for account access. Then, working together, they'd drain retirement savings, college funds, anything they could get their hands on, using forged documents and identity theft to cover their tracks. Total estimated theft: over $600,000 from vulnerable families who'd worked their entire lives to build modest security. Emma stared at her screen, feeling something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about her family anymore. This was about Mrs. Peterson down the street, who reminded Emma so much of her grandmother. This was about all the elderly people who trusted their adult children to protect them, only to discover that trust could be the most dangerous gift of all. She thought about her father, probably in some Boston hotel room right now, counting money that belonged to people who'd earned every dollar through decades of honest work. She thought about Sophia, sleeping peacefully while 20 families faced financial ruin. She thought about her grandmother downstairs, probably lying awake wondering what she'd done wrong as a mother. But mostly, Emma thought about her mother's words: "Numbers don't lie, sweetheart." Well, the numbers were telling a very clear story now. And Emma Collins, all 14 years and 97 pounds of her, decided it was time to make sure someone listened. She opened a new browser window and began typing an email to the Massachusetts Division of Financial Services, then another to the Vermont Attorney General's office, then another to the Federal Trade Commission. By the time dawn broke over the Green Mountains, Emma had compiled a detailed dossier of evidence that would make seasoned investigators proud. But she wasn't done yet, not even close, because Emma had realized something that chilled her to the bone. If they could steal from her family this easily, they were probably still stealing from others right now. Every day she waited was another day some grandmother somewhere lost her life savings to the two people Emma had once called family. When Margaret woke up that Friday morning to find Emma already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a stack of printed documents beside her cereal bowl, She knew their quiet life had shifted into something she didn't recognize. Her granddaughter's face held an expression Margaret had seen before, but never on someone so young. The look of someone who'd been forced to grow up overnight. "Grandma," Emma said without looking up from her screen, "we need to talk about Dad." Margaret poured herself coffee with hands that trembled slightly. She'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd somehow failed as a mother, if there were signs she'd missed that might have prevented Daniel's abandonment. Now, looking at Emma's determined face, she felt a different kind of dread settling in her stomach. "Honey, I know yesterday was hard, but your father, sometimes adults make decisions that don't make sense, especially when they're struggling. He stole our money, Grandma. All of it." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She set her coffee cup down carefully. "The way you handle something that might shatter if you move too quickly." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emma turned the laptop around, and Margaret found herself staring at bank statements she didn't recognize, transaction records that made no sense, numbers that seemed impossible. Her retirement savings, gone. Emma's college fund, empty. Even their modest emergency account had been drained. "I've been tracking the transfers since 3 this morning," Emma said, her voice unnaturally calm. "Dad and his girlfriend Sophia have been stealing from us for months. But it's not just us, Grandma. They've been doing this to lots of families. Mostly older people like you." Margaret sank into her chair, feeling suddenly ancient. The numbers on the screen blurred together, but their meaning was crystal clear. Her son, her boy, the one she'd raised to believe in honesty and family loyalty, had systematically robbed her while looking her in the eye every morning at breakfast. "Are you sure?" she whispered, though she could see Emma was absolutely sure. The evidence was right there in black and white, undeniable as a cancer diagnosis. Emma pulled up another screen, showing a professional headshot of an attractive woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a trustworthy smile. Sophia Ramirez, Senior Financial Advisor. She specializes in retirement planning, which is basically perfect cover for targeting elderly people. Look at this. The next screen showed complaint after complaint filed with various state agencies. Pattern recognition wasn't just Emma's gift with computers. It was how her mind worked with everything. And the pattern here was clear. Sophia would identify adult children in financial trouble, offer them a partnership in what she called aggressive investment strategies, then use their access to family accounts to systematically drain elderly parents' life savings. 23 families so far that I can identify, Emma continued, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used when explaining complicated math concepts. Total theft over $600,000. The average victim age is 72. Margaret stared at her granddaughter, this child who just lost her father's presence and discovered his betrayal, and marveled at Emma's strength. Most 14-year-olds would be curled up in bed, crying about abandonment. Instead, Emma had spent the night conducting a financial investigation that would shame professional auditors. "What will we do now?" Margaret asked, feeling helpless in a way she hadn't since Robert's funeral 6 years ago. Emma's expression shifted, and for the first time since Daniel's departure, Margaret saw something dangerous flicker in her granddaughter's eyes. "We make sure they can't hurt anyone else." What happened next would later be described by investigators as one of the most thorough citizen complaint packages they'd ever received. Emma had documented everything. Money trails, forged signatures, identity theft evidence, even a detailed timeline showing how Sophia had gradually gained Daniel's trust before suggesting their partnership. But Emma didn't stop at filing complaints. She did something that Margaret couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. She called her father. Daniel answered on the third ring, and Margaret could hear his voice through the phone, artificially cheerful in the way of someone trying too hard to seem casual. "Emma, hey, kiddo, I was just thinking about you. How's school going? Where's the money, Dad?" The silence that followed lasted so long Margaret wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of casual warmth. "What money? Emma, I don't know what you're talking about." "Grandma's retirement savings, my college fund, the money from Mr. Henderson in Rutland, and Mrs. Chun in Lebanon, and all the other families you and Sophia have been stealing from." Margaret watched her granddaughter destroy her father with nothing but facts, delivered in a voice that never wavered, never broke. Emma had printed out bank statements, had account numbers, had dates and amounts and transaction codes. When someone lies to you, Emma had learned from her mother, you don't argue with their feelings. You argue with their math. Emma, you don't understand. It's complicated. Sophia was helping us invest the money, make it grow. Sometimes investments take time to... You liquidated Grandma's retirement account on March 15th and transferred it to an account in Boston that same day. That's not an investment, Dad. That's theft. Margaret heard something in Daniel's voice then that made her close her eyes in pain. Not shame, not remorse, but irritation. The annoyance of someone caught in a lie by someone they'd underestimated. Look, Emma, you're just a kid. You don't understand how the real world works. Your grandmother's money wasn't making anything sitting in those accounts. Sophia showed me how we could triple it, maybe quadruple it with the right investments. The money's safe. Then give it back. It doesn't work that way. The money's tied up in... Give it back, or I send this evidence to the police. The silence that followed was different this time. Margaret could practically hear Daniel's mind racing, probably wondering how much his 14-year-old daughter actually knew, how much trouble he was really in. Emma, he said finally, and his voice carried a tone Margaret had never heard before. Part pleading, part threat. Family doesn't turn on family. Whatever you think you found, we can work this out. Just don't do anything stupid, okay? Don't make this worse than it has to be. Emma looked at Margaret, and in that moment, grandmother and granddaughter shared something profound. The recognition that Daniel wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for silence. He was asking them to be complicit in their own destruction. I already sent the evidence to the State Financial Crimes Unit 20 minutes ago, Emma said quietly. And Dad, we're not the ones who made this worse. She hung up the phone, and Margaret realized that her granddaughter had just declared war on her own father in order to protect not just their family, but families they'd never even met. The beauty of modern technology, Emma had learned from her computer science teacher, is that it makes information flow like water, always finding the path of least resistance, always leaving traces, always connecting everything to everything else. What her teacher hadn't mentioned was that sometimes, when you follow those digital streams, you discover that the people you love have been drowning others while you weren't looking. 3 hours after Emma hung up on her father, their landline started ringing. Then it rang again, and again. Each time, Margaret would answer to find silence on the other end, followed by a soft click. By the 5th call, Emma had connected her laptop to the phone system and started tracing the calls. They were all coming from the same number, Daniel's cell phone. He's panicking. Emma observed with the clinical detachment she'd inherited from her mother. He's probably trying to figure out how much we actually know versus how much we're guessing. Margaret felt sick. The idea that her son was now treating them like adversaries, that he was calculating how to outmaneuver his own family, seemed impossible to reconcile with the boy who used to leave her handmade Mother's Day cards every year until he was 16. But Emma wasn't done. While Margaret struggled with the emotional weight of betrayal, her granddaughter was operating on pure intellectual fury, the kind that comes from discovering that math doesn't lie, but people do. She'd spent the morning creating what she called a financial crime timeline, cross-referencing bank records with her father's claimed whereabouts over the past 6 months. Look at this, Emma said, pulling up a spreadsheet that would have impressed professional investigators. Dad said he was job hunting in Burlington on February 12th, remember? But that's the same day someone using his identity opened a credit line against your house in Boston. Same day, Grandma. He wasn't looking for work. He was finding new ways to steal from us. The house. Margaret's stomach dropped as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Her home, the one she and Robert had scrimped and saved to buy, the one where they'd raised Daniel and where she was now raising Emma, it had been used as collateral without her knowledge. How much? Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. $47,000. They took out a reverse mortgage application, using forged documents. It's been sitting in pending approval because they needed additional verification. But if it had gone through... Emma's voice trailed off, but Margaret understood. If Sophia and Daniel had succeeded, they would have stolen the house itself. That's when Margaret Collins, retired English teacher and woman who'd spent her entire life believing in the fundamental goodness of people, finally felt the cold rage that her granddaughter had been carrying all morning. "Call them back," she said quietly. Emma looked up from her laptop, surprised. "What?" "Call your father. I want to talk to him." What followed was a conversation that Margaret would replay in her mind for years afterward. When Daniel answered, his voice carried forced casualness again, as if the morning's revelations had been nothing more than a minor misunderstanding. "Mom, I'm glad you called. Emma got a little confused about some financial stuff, but I can explain everything if you just—" "Daniel Robert Collins," Margaret interrupted, using his full name the way she had when he was 8 years old and had broken Mrs. Fletcher's window with a baseball. "You forged my signature." Silence. "You stole Emma's college fund." More silence. "You mortgaged my house without my knowledge." Finally, "Mom, it's not what you think. Sophia has connections. She knows people who can make investments that regular banks won't touch. The money's not gone. It's working harder for us. In 2 years, we'll have enough to pay everything back plus give you more than you ever dreamed of." Margaret closed her eyes. Even now, caught red-handed with documentation that would make prosecutors weep with joy, Daniel was still lying, still treating her like she was too stupid to understand what he'd done. "Where are you?" she asked. "I can't tell you that right now. Sophia says we need to let the investments mature before we—" "Where are you, Daniel?" Something in her tone must have cut through his delusions, because his voice suddenly turned sharp with desperation. "Look, I know you're upset, but if you report this to the police, you'll ruin everything. Not just for me, for all of us. You'll never see that money again if you get the law involved. These investment opportunities, they don't work through normal channels. You have to trust me." Emma was watching her grandmother's face, and what she saw there made her take out her own phone and start recording, because Emma had realized something that Daniel hadn't. Their conversation was creating evidence in real time. "Put Sophia on the phone," Margaret said. She's not here right now." "Daniel, I've been teaching teenagers how to lie for 32 years. Put Sophia on the phone, or I hang up and call the state police." More silence, then muffled conversation in the background. Finally, a woman's voice came on the line. Professional, soothing, exactly the kind of voice you trust with your life savings. "Mrs. Collins, this is Sophia. I understand there's been some confusion about the financial restructuring we've been working on with Daniel. Let me assure you, everything we've done has been completely legitimate and designed to maximize your family's financial security." Margaret felt Emma's hand slip into hers, warm and steady, and drew strength from her granddaughter's presence. "Ms. Ramirez, I'm going to ask you a very simple question, and I want a very simple answer. Can you return our money today? Right now while I'm on this phone?" "Well, it's not quite that simple. The funds are currently positioned in several high-yield opportunities that have specific maturation periods. Withdrawing them prematurely would result in significant penalties that would ultimately cost your family. Yes or no? Can you return our money today?" The pause that followed told Margaret everything she needed to know. When Sophia finally spoke, her voice had lost its professional warmth. "Mrs. Collins, I think you're making a mistake that could have serious consequences for your family's financial future. Daniel and I worked very hard to position your assets for maximum growth, and if you force us to liquidate these investments prematurely, you'll be throwing away opportunities that most people never get access to." Emma squeezed her grandmother's hand and whispered, "They don't have it anymore. They've already spent it or moved it somewhere we can't trace." Margaret felt something settle in her chest. Not resignation, but clarity. Her son and this woman weren't trying to convince her they were innocent. They were trying to convince her to stay quiet while they finished destroying her family's financial future. "Ms. Ramirez," Margaret said, "I'm 73 years old, and I've been fooled by exactly one person in my entire life. Unfortunately, that person was my own son, and he chose you as an accomplice. But I want you to know something. My granddaughter is 14 years old, and she's already smarter than both of you combined." What Margaret didn't tell Sophia during that phone call was that Emma had been recording everything, and more importantly, that her granddaughter had spent the previous hour doing something that would have impressed FBI forensic accountants. Emma had traced Sophia's professional history across 3 states, uncovered a pattern of targeting financially vulnerable families, and discovered that the Boston Capital Management, where Sophia claimed to work, had never heard of her. She's not even a licensed financial advisor, Emma explained after Margaret hung up, pulling up official state registration databases on her laptop. Look, she's using the address of a real financial firm, but her name isn't in any of their employee directories. The license number she uses on her business cards, it belongs to someone named Michael Rodriguez, who's been dead for 2 years. Margaret stared at the screen, feeling the last of her maternal illusions crumble. This wasn't just theft. It was sophisticated fraud involving identity theft, forged documents, and what appeared to be an organized scheme to prey on elderly Americans and their families. Her son hadn't stumbled into bad judgment. He'd chosen to become part of something deliberately evil. "There's more," Emma said quietly, and Margaret braced herself. "I found Dad's real location." She tracked the cell phone calls back to their source using techniques she'd learned from YouTube videos about digital forensics. The calls were coming from an extended-stay motel outside Boston, the kind of place people use when they're between lives or hiding from their old ones. But Emma had gone further than just location tracking. She'd found social media posts. "Dad's been posting pictures on Instagram," Emma said, turning the laptop screen toward Margaret. "Look at this one from yesterday." The photo showed Daniel and Sophia at what appeared to be an expensive restaurant. Champagne glasses raised in a toast, both of them smiling with the kind of carefree joy that comes from spending other people's money. The location tag read, "Top of the Hub, Boston." Margaret recognized the place. She and Robert had gone there once for their 25th anniversary, and she remembered being shocked by the prices. "This dinner probably cost more than we spend on groceries in a month," Emma observed with devastating accuracy. "And look at the timestamp. This was posted 3 hours after Dad called crying about how the money was tied up in investments he couldn't access." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. It was one thing to discover that your son had stolen from you out of desperation. It was another to realize he was celebrating that theft with champagne and Instagram posts while lying to your face about financial hardship. But Emma wasn't done building her case. She found other photos, Daniel and Sophia shopping at high-end stores, staying at boutique hotels, living a lifestyle that would have been impossible on Daniel's unemployment benefits and Sophia's non-existent advisor salary. Every image was tagged with locations, dates, and times that Emma had cross-referenced with the dates money had been withdrawn from the family accounts. They'd been taking vacations to New York, staying at hotels that cost $400 a night, eating at restaurants where the wine cost more than Grandma's monthly Social Security check, Emma said, her voice taking on the prosecutorial tone that came from her mother's analytical mind. And they've been documenting all of it online like they're proud of what they're doing. Margaret looked at image after image of her son living in luxury while she'd been clipping coupons and buying generic groceries to stretch their household budget. She thought about all the times Daniel had eaten dinner at her table, accepting her care and cooking while simultaneously draining her life savings to fund his getaway with another woman. "How long?" Margaret asked. "How long have they been doing this?" Emma pulled up a timeline she created, color-coded by victim, family, and theft amount. "The earliest victim I can find is from 18 months ago, an elderly couple in Brattleboro who lost their entire retirement savings. But the pattern really accelerated about 8 months ago, right around the time Dad started spending more time away from home." 8 months ago. Margaret remembered that time period clearly. Daniel had claimed to be taking classes to upgrade his IT certifications, said he was finally getting his life back together after Sarah's death. Instead, he'd been learning how to systematically rob elderly families with Sophia as his teacher. "The other victims," Margaret said, "do we know how they're doing?" Emma's expression grew somber. "Some of them are okay. They had other savings or family support. But others..." She pulled up news articles she'd found through Google searches. An elderly man in New Hampshire who'd lost his farm because he couldn't make the mortgage payments after his savings were stolen. A grandmother in Maine who'd had to move in with relatives because she could no longer afford her apartment. Mrs. Patterson in Rutland, Emma said quietly. She's 83 years old and her son helped Sophia steal $47,000 from her. That was her entire life savings. The article says she's now working part-time at a grocery store to pay for her medications. Margaret felt tears threaten for the first time since this nightmare began. Not for herself, not even for Emma, but for Mrs. Patterson and all the other grandparents who trusted their children only to discover that trust could be weaponized against them. What do we do? Margaret asked. How do we make sure they can't hurt anyone else? Emma's eyes lit up with the kind of fierce determination Margaret had seen in her daughter-in-law during Sarah's final months fighting cancer. When Sarah had decided to battle her disease, she'd approached it like a research project, learning everything about treatments and trials and experimental therapies. Emma had inherited that same focus intensity, and now she was turning against the people who betrayed their family. We make them famous, Emma said, but not the good kind of famous. What Emma had in mind was something her generation understood instinctively, but older adults often struggle with: the power of social media to turn private betrayals into public accountability. She'd already compiled evidence packages for law enforcement, but she'd also realized that legal processes move slowly, while Sophia and Daniel were probably targeting new victims right now. I'm going to create a website, Emma explained, a resource for families to report elderly fraud protection failures and check if their financial advisors are legitimate. I'll call it Safe Nest Financial Watch. And Sophia Ramirez is going to be our very first case study. Margaret looked at her granddaughter, this child who'd lost her father yesterday and discovered his betrayal today, and realized that Emma wasn't just surviving this catastrophe. She was transforming it into something that might prevent other families from experiencing the same devastation. Won't that be dangerous? Margaret asked. If Sophia and your father realize what you're doing? Emma smiled for the first time since Daniel had walked out, and it reminded Margaret so strongly of Sarah that her breath caught. Grandma, Emma said, they should have thought about that before they mess with a family that includes a computer science prodigy with a very long memory and absolutely nothing left to lose. By Sunday morning, Emma's website was live, and Sophia Ramirez had no idea she was about to become internet famous for all the wrong reasons. Safe Nest Financial Watch looked professional, trustworthy, exactly the kind of resource concerned families might stumble across while Googling suspicious financial advisors. Emma had designed it to rank high in search results for terms like Sophia Ramirez Boston Financial Advisor and Elderly Fraud Protection Massachusetts. But the website was more than just a warning system. Emma had turned it into a honey trap. The brilliant thing about her approach, Margaret realized as she watched her granddaughter work, was that Emma understood something adults often miss. Criminals can't resist the urge to monitor their own reputation. Sophia would inevitably Google herself, find the website, and when she did, Emma would know exactly when and where she was looking. I embedded tracking code that logs IP addresses, device information, even browser fingerprints, Emma explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who'd grown up speaking digital as a second language. The moment Sophia visits the site, I'll know her location, what device she's using, probably even what hotel Wi-Fi network she's connected to. Margaret brought Emma a sandwich, turkey and Swiss on a homemade bread she'd learned to make during the pandemic, and marveled at how her granddaughter could discuss advanced cyberstalking techniques while methodically eating lunch. This strange new version of normal was something Margaret was still adjusting to, a world where 14-year-olds conducted financial investigations between algebra homework, and where grandmothers learned about IP tracking over Sunday afternoon snacks. Has anyone else contacted you yet? Margaret asked. Other families who've been hurt by them? Emma's expression grew serious. 3 so far. Mrs. Chun from Lebanon called this morning after she saw the website. Her daughter helped Sophia steal $62,000 from her, money she'd been saving to pay for her husband's dialysis treatments. And Mr. Rodriguez in Burlington? He lost his entire pension because his son needed investment capital for Sophia's fake opportunities. Each new victim felt like another weight on Margaret's chest. These weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were real people whose trust had been transformed into a weapon against them. People like her, who'd worked their entire lives to build modest security only to watch it disappear into the bank accounts of people who viewed their parents as nothing more than ATM machines with nostalgic attachments. The worst part, Emma continued, is that most of them still don't want to report their own children to the police. Mrs. Shin kept saying, but she's still my daughter, you know? Maybe if I just talked to her. Margaret understood that sentiment too well. Even now, knowing everything she knew about Daniel's betrayal, part of her kept hoping this was all some terrible misunderstanding that could be fixed with the right conversation. That's the cruel gift children give their parents. The ability to hope beyond all reason, to see potential redemption even in the face of undeniable evidence. But Emma had moved beyond hope into something more powerful, strategic thinking. I've been analyzing their spending patterns, she said, pulling up another spreadsheet that tracked Daniel and Sophia's social media posts alongside ATM withdrawals and credit card transactions. They're not random. They have a system. Every time they hit a new victim for a large amount, they disappear for exactly 5 days. Always 5 days, always to expensive locations, always celebrated with champagne dinners and shopping sprees. Why 5 days? I think that's how long it takes for most elderly victims to realize they've been robbed and contact their banks. By the time the fraud reports are filed and accounts get frozen, Sophia and Dad are already back, laying low and planning their next target. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Next target? Emma nodded grimly. They're not done, Grandma. Based on their pattern, they should be hitting someone new this week. Probably someone Dad has already identified and been cultivating for months. That's when Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID showed her sister Patricia's number from Manchester, New Hampshire. Patricia was 78, recently widowed, and had been talking for months about needing help managing the finances that her late husband Harold had always handled. Margaret's stomach dropped as she realized a horrible possibility. Maggie, Patricia's voice sounded confused, worried. I hope you don't mind me calling on a Sunday, but I have the strangest question. Danny contacted me yesterday about some investment opportunity. Said he's working with a financial advisor now who specializes in helping widows like me maximize their retirement income. But something felt off about the whole thing, you know? Emma's eyes went wide. She grabbed a notebook and started writing frantically, Aunt Patricia equals next target. What exactly did Daniel tell you? Margaret asked, her voice carefully neutral while her heart hammered against her ribs. Well, he said this advisor, Sophia something, had identified some special government program for widows that could triple my Social Security payments if I move Harold's life insurance money into the right kind of account. Danny was very sweet about it. Said he knew how hard it's been since Harold died, and he'd hate to see me struggle when there were opportunities out there I didn't know about. Margaret looked at Emma, who was now typing furiously on her laptop. On the screen, her granddaughter was pulling up Patricia's financial information. Social Security records, property ownership, even Harold's obituary with its mention of his 30-year career at the aircraft factory. Patricia, Margaret said carefully, don't give Daniel any information about your finances. Not yet. Can you come visit me this week? I think we need to talk in person about some family matters. Is everything all right? You sound worried. Margaret looked at Emma, who held up a handwritten note. Don't tell her on the phone. They might be listening. Everything's fine, Margaret lied. I just miss you, and Emma would love to see her great-aunt Patricia. How about Tuesday afternoon? After Margaret hung up, Emma pulled up a map showing the location of Patricia's last call. She called from her house in Manchester, which means Dad probably knows her address, her financial situation, maybe even her daily routine. Aunt Patricia fits their victim profile perfectly. Recent widow, substantial life insurance settlement, adult nephew she trusts who's offering to help with money management. Margaret felt sick. It was bad enough that Daniel had betrayed his own immediate family, but now he was systematically targeting extended family members, using Margaret's own sister as his next victim. We have to warn her, Margaret said. We will, Emma replied. But first, we're going to do something else. We're going to make sure this is the last family Dad and Sophia ever get the chance to hurt. Emma turned back to her laptop and pulled up a screen Margaret didn't recognize. Some kind of law enforcement portal with official seals and badge numbers. I've been corresponding with Detective Sarah Morrison from the Massachusetts State Police Financial Crimes Unit. Emma explained. She's been investigating Sophia for 8 months, but they've never been able to get solid evidence or predict where she'd strike next. Until now. Margaret watched her granddaughter compose an email with the efficiency of someone who'd been working with law enforcement her entire life, instead of just discovering crime 3 days ago. I'm sending Detective Morrison everything. Dad's location, their spending patterns, their social media posts, and most importantly, information about their next intended victim. If we time this right, we can catch them in the act of attempting fraud instead of just cleaning up after they've already succeeded. Emma hit send, then looked at her grandmother with an expression that was equal parts determined and heartbroken. "Grandma," she said quietly, "when they arrest Dad, are you going to be okay?" Margaret reached across the table and took her granddaughter's hand. Somewhere in the past 3 days, Emma had transformed from a child Margaret was protecting into a young woman who was protecting her. The role reversal should have felt wrong, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Sweetheart," Margaret said, "your father stopped being my little boy the moment he decided our family was worth less than whatever Sophia was offering him. What you're doing now, this is what real family looks like." Detective Sarah Morrison called back within 2 hours, and when Margaret answered the phone, she could hear the excitement in the officer's voice that comes from finally catching a break in a case that's been consuming your life. "Mrs. Collins, I have to tell you, what your granddaughter has compiled here is extraordinary. We've been trying to build a case against Sophia Ramirez for months, but she's been incredibly careful about covering her digital tracks. Emma's documentation gives us everything we need for arrests and asset seizure warrants." Emma was listening on speakerphone, and Margaret watched her granddaughter's expression shift from satisfaction to something that looked almost like grief. Because no matter how justified this was, no matter how necessary, Emma was still helping to put her own father in prison. "There's one thing I need to ask," Detective Morrison continued. "Would you be willing to participate in a controlled operation? We'd like to arrange a meeting between your family and the suspects, but in a monitored environment where we can record everything they say. It would give us their admissions on tape and help us identify any other victims we might not know about." Margaret looked at Emma, who nodded slowly. They both understood what the detective was really asking. Would they be willing to look Daniel in the eye one more time, to give him a chance to tell the truth or compound his lies, knowing that everything he said would be used against him in court? What would that involve? Margaret asked. "We'd set up a meeting in a neutral location, probably a family restaurant where they'd feel comfortable talking. You'd wear recording devices, and we'd have officers nearby but not visible. The goal would be to get them talking about the money, about other victims, about their future plans. Essentially, let them hang themselves with their own words." Emma leaned toward the phone. "Detective Morrison, this is Emma. Would this help the other families get their money back?" "It could, yes. If we can get them to admit where the money went, what assets they've purchased, which accounts they're using, it makes asset recovery much more likely. Without that information, even after conviction, most victims never see their savings again." That settled it for Emma. Margaret could see the decision form in her granddaughter's eyes. The same look Sarah used to get when she made up her mind about something important. "We'll do it," Emma said, "but I want to be there too." "Absolutely not," Margaret said immediately. "Emma, these people have already shown they're willing to hurt family members for money. I'm not putting you in the same room with them. Grandma, with respect, they need to see me. They need to understand that the person who caught them is someone they dismissed as just a kid. Dad needs to know that the daughter he abandoned is the one who brought him down." Detective Morrison's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd worked with crime victims long enough to recognize when family dynamics were more complicated than the law could address. "Mrs. Collins, I understand your concerns, but Emma has a point. Often in these family fraud cases, the perpetrators will be more likely to reveal information if they're confronted by the people they've directly harmed. And frankly, Emma's understanding of the evidence is better than most of my investigators. She'd be valuable to have there." Margaret wanted to protect her granddaughter from this final confrontation, but she also recognized something important. Emma had earned the right to face her father. She'd done the work, built the case, and identified the other victims. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. "All right," Margaret said, "but we do this carefully. The meeting was set for Wednesday afternoon at a family restaurant in Brattleboro, halfway between Margaret's house in Boston. Detective Morrison chose a location strategically, public enough that Daniel and Sophia would feel safe, quiet enough that recording equipment would pick up clear audio, with enough exits that law enforcement could move quickly if things went wrong. Emma spent Monday and Tuesday preparing like she was studying for the most important exam of her life. She practiced conversations with Margaret, anticipated every excuse Daniel might offer, prepared responses to every manipulation Sophia might attempt. Margaret watched her granddaughter transform herself into someone who could face down adults who'd spent months systematically betraying her trust. "Remember," Emma said Tuesday night as they went over their plan one final time, "they're going to try to make us feel guilty. Dad's going to say he did this for us, or that he was desperate, or that we don't understand how hard it's been for him. Sophia's going to present herself as the victim, like she was trying to help, and everything went wrong accidentally." Margaret marveled at her granddaughter's insight into criminal psychology. "How do you know all this?" "I've been reading about financial fraud cases online. There are patterns to how scammers behave when they get caught. They almost never accept responsibility. They always blame circumstances or other people or their victims for being naive. The goal is to make you feel sorry for them so you won't press charges." Wednesday afternoon arrived with the kind of gray November, whether that makes everything feel ominous. Margaret and Emma drove to Brattleboro in silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what they were about to face. The recording devices Detective Morrison had given them were so small they were invisible, but Margaret felt like she was wearing a sign announcing their true purpose. Daniel was already there when they arrived, sitting in a corner booth with Sophia beside him. Margaret's first thought was how healthy he looked, rested, well-dressed, clearly well-fed. Whatever stress he claimed to be under hadn't affected his appearance. Sophia was exactly what Margaret had expected. Attractive, professional, with the kind of smile that probably convinced people to trust her with their life savings. Emma walked toward their table with her shoulders straight and her chin up, and Margaret felt a surge of pride so intense it almost brought tears to her eyes. 3 days ago, this child had been abandoned by her father. Today, she was about to confront him as an equal. "Dad," Emma said simply, sliding into the booth across from Daniel. "Sophia." Daniel's expression was a mixture of relief and nervousness. "Emma, kiddo, I'm so glad you called. Your mom and I have been worried sick about you and Grandma. When you hung up on me the other day, I thought maybe you were angrier than I realized." Margaret sat down beside Emma, noting how Daniel couldn't quite meet their eyes. Sophia, by contrast, was studying them with the kind of calculating attention Margaret had seen in students who were trying to figure out exactly how much trouble they were in. "We need to talk," Margaret said. "About the money." "Right, the money." Daniel leaned forward, his voice taking on the earnest tone he'd used as a child when explaining why he'd missed curfew or forgotten to do his chores. "Mom, I know this looks bad, but I can explain everything. Sophia has been helping me understand investment opportunities that most people never get access to. The money isn't gone, it's working for us." Emma pulled out her laptop, the same one she'd used to track them down, and opened it on the table between them. On the screen was a detailed spreadsheet showing every transaction, every withdrawal, every luxury purchase they'd made with stolen money. "Which investments?" Emma asked quietly. "The ones that paid for your hotel suite in Boston? Or the ones that bought Sophia's new Mercedes?" The color drained from Daniel's face, and Margaret watched her son realize that his 14-year-old daughter knew everything. What happened next was something Margaret would remember for the rest of her life, not because it was dramatic or violent, but because it was the exact moment she watched her son choose who he really was. Daniel stared at Emma's laptop screen for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions Margaret recognized from decades of teaching. The desperate calculation of someone caught cheating who was trying to figure out if they could still talk their way out of trouble. When he finally looked up, his expression had hardened into something Margaret had never seen before. "You've been spying on me," he said, and there was no shame in his voice, no remorse. Only accusation, as if Emma was the one who had done something wrong. "I've been protecting our family," Emma replied, her voice steady as granite, "which is apparently more than I can say for you. Sophia leaned forward, and Margaret could practically see her switching into damage control mode. Emma, sweetie, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Your father and I have been working very hard to grow your family's money, but these kinds of sophisticated investments take time to mature. What you're seeing in those bank statements is just the normal movement of funds between different investment vehicles. Emma turned her laptop around so Sophia could see the screen clearly. Which investment vehicle paid for your dinner at Top of the Hub last Thursday? Because according to your Instagram post, you spent more on one meal than my grandmother's monthly grocery budget. Margaret watched Sophia's professional mask slip for just a moment, revealing something cold underneath. I don't think it's appropriate for a child to be questioning adult financial decisions she doesn't understand. You're right, Emma said calmly. I'm just a kid. So let me ask you a simple kid question. If you're such a successful financial advisor, why isn't your name listed with the Massachusetts Board of Financial Services? Why does your business license number belong to a dead man? And why does Boston Capital Management have no record of ever employing you? The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could hear the soft clink of silverware from other tables, the distant sound of the kitchen, the ordinary sounds of people living ordinary lives while her family sat in the wreckage of betrayal. Daniel broke first. Emma, you don't understand what you're messing with here. This isn't some game where you get to play detective. Sophia has connections. She knows people who don't like being investigated by little girls with computers. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Margaret felt something fierce and protective rise up in her chest. Are you threatening your own daughter, Daniel? I'm trying to protect her. Daniel's voice rose, drawing glances from other diners. She's gotten herself involved in things that are way over her head, and if she doesn't stop digging around in business that doesn't concern her, she could get hurt. Emma laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. Get hurt? Dad, you stole my college fund. You forged Grandma's signature on loan documents. You've been planning to disappear forever and leave us with nothing. How exactly could I be more hurt than I already am? The money's not gone, Daniel insisted. It's just temporarily inaccessible. Sophia's investors require certain security protocols that make immediate withdrawal difficult, but in 6 months, maybe a year, you'll have more money than you ever dreamed of. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and realized he actually believed what he was saying. After months of systematic theft, after documented evidence of luxury spending, after being caught in lie after lie, Daniel had convinced himself that he was somehow the good guy in this story. Daniel, Margaret said quietly, show me the investment documents. What? If our money is in legitimate investments, there should be paperwork, contracts, prospectuses, account statements. Show me something official that proves our money still exists. Daniel and Sophia exchanged a look that told Margaret everything she needed to know. It's not that simple, Sophia said. These are private investment opportunities that require discretionary management. Individual account statements would compromise the security protocols that protect all the investors. Emma pulled up another screen on her laptop. Is that why you've been using our stolen money to target other families? Mrs. Chun in Lebanon, Mr. Rodriguez in Burlington, Mrs. Patterson in Rutland? Are they all part of these mysterious investments, too? Margaret watched the blood drain from Daniel's face as he realized the full scope of what Emma had discovered. This wasn't just about their family anymore. Emma had uncovered an entire network of elderly victims, and she had documentation that could send both Daniel and Sophia to prison for years. How did you... Daniel started, then stopped himself. How did I what, Dad? How did I figure out that you and Sophia have been systematically robbing elderly people for months? How did I track down 23 different families you've stolen from? How did I connect your social media posts with ATM withdrawals from victim accounts? Emma leaned forward, and Margaret saw something in her granddaughter's eyes that reminded her of Sarah in her final days fighting cancer. Absolute clarity about what needed to be done, regardless of the cost. The better question, Emma continued, is how did you think you were going to get away with it? Did you really believe I wouldn't notice our money disappearing? Did you think Grandma would just accept that her retirement savings vanished into thin air? Or were you counting on us being too ashamed to report our own family member to the police? Daniel's composure finally cracked completely. I never wanted to go this far. Sophia said it would just be a small loan, something to tide us over until I could find real work. But then the opportunities kept getting bigger, and the returns were so good. And I thought if I could just make enough money fast enough, I could pay everything back plus give you more than you'd ever had before. With other people's money, Emma said flatly, with smart investments. Daniel shot back. Do you think rich people got rich by leaving their money in savings accounts earning 1% interest? Sophia showed me how the system really works, how wealthy people really build wealth. I was trying to give our family the same opportunities. Margaret felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, which had been breaking steadily for days, but her last hope that Daniel might somehow still be the son she'd raised. Daniel, she said, you stole money from your own daughter's college fund to take your girlfriend on vacation. That's not an investment strategy. That's theft with extra steps. Sophia stood up abruptly. I don't have to listen to this. Daniel, we're leaving. But Daniel didn't move. He sat there staring at Emma, and Margaret could see him finally understanding the magnitude of what his daughter had accomplished. This child he'd abandoned, this family he'd betrayed, had somehow managed to unravel months of carefully planned criminal activity in less than a week. How much do you know? He asked quietly. Emma's smile was sharp as winter wind. Everything, Dad. Absolutely everything. That's when Detective Morrison and two other officers walked into the restaurant, and Daniel Collins learned that his daughter's investigation had been thorough enough to put him in federal prison. The arrest was quieter than Margaret had expected. No dramatic confrontation. No desperate chase to the restaurant. No shouted protest of innocence. Daniel simply looked at the badges Detective Morrison showed him, glanced once at Emma's laptop screen still displaying months of documented evidence, and said, I want to call a lawyer. Sophia tried to run. She made it exactly 15 feet before two officers who'd been positioned by the restaurant's back exit gently, but firmly escorted her back to the table. Margaret watched this woman who'd spent months systematically destroying elderly families' financial security get handcuffed with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested law enforcement had been looking forward to this moment for quite some time. Daniel Collins, Sophia Ramirez, you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, and elder abuse, Detective Morrison announced in a voice that carried clearly through the suddenly quiet restaurant. You have the right to remain silent. Emma sat perfectly still during the entire arrest, watching her father with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. Not satisfaction, not grief, but something like completion, the look of someone who'd started a job and seen it through to the end, regardless of the personal cost. As they led Daniel away, he turned back toward their table one last time. Margaret expected him to say something to her, some final attempt at explanation or apology. Instead, he looked directly at Emma. I hope you're proud of yourself, he said, and his voice carried more bitterness than Margaret had ever heard from her son. You just sent your own father to prison. Emma met his gaze without flinching. No, Dad, you sent yourself to prison. I just made sure you didn't take anyone else down with you. Those were the last words Daniel Collins ever spoke to his daughter. The weeks that followed blurred together in a series of legal proceedings, media interviews, and the strange new reality of being at the center of what prosecutors called one of the most sophisticated elderly fraud schemes ever uncovered in New England. Emma's website, Safe Nest Financial Watch, became a model for how families could protect themselves from financial scams, and her documentation methods were studied by law enforcement agencies across the country. But the most important developments happened quietly, in phone calls and visits from families Margaret had never met. Mrs. Chun came from Lebanon, bringing homemade dumplings and tears of gratitude. Emma saved my husband's life, she told Margaret. Without his dialysis money, we didn't know what we were going to do. Now at least some of it will be returned to us. Mr. Rodriguez drove down from Burlington with his wife, both of them wanting to meet the teenager who would help recover a portion of his stolen pension. 37 years I worked at that factory, he told Emma. 37 years building that pension fund. I thought it was gone forever. Mrs. Patterson from Rutland was too frail to travel, but she sent a letter written in the careful handwriting of someone who'd grown up when penmanship mattered. Dear Emma, I am 83 years old, and all my years I have never met anyone as brave as you. You chose to do the right thing even when it meant hurting your own family. And because of that choice, families like mine have hope again. Thank you for proving that there are still good people in the world. Daniel was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Sophia received 8 years, having been identified as the mastermind of the operation. The judge, a grandmother herself, made it clear during sentencing that she viewed their crimes as particularly heinous. You didn't just steal money, Judge Patricia Hernandez said from the bench. You stole security from people who had worked their entire lives to build modest comfort in their golden years. You stole peace of mind from families who trusted you. And perhaps most cruelly, you weaponized family relationships, turning the love between parents and children into a tool for financial exploitation. Of the $600,000 stolen from 23 families, investigators were able to recover approximately $180,000 from seized assets and frozen accounts. It wasn't enough to make anyone whole, but it was enough to help. Emma's college fund was partially restored, and Margaret got back roughly a quarter of her retirement savings. More importantly, SafeNest Financial Watch had helped prevent at least 12 additional elderly fraud cases in the 6 months since its launch, including stopping Sophia's former partners from targeting Patricia Collins. You know what the strangest part is? Emma said one evening as she and Margaret sat in their kitchen, the same kitchen where this whole nightmare had started. I used to be angry that Dad left us. Now I'm grateful. Margaret looked up from the letter she was reading. Another thank you note from a family Emma had helped protect. Grateful? If he'd stayed, if he'd just been a regular deadbeat dad instead of criminal, we never would have discovered what he and Sophia were doing to other families. Mrs. Chen's husband might have died because he couldn't afford dialysis. Mr. Rodriguez might have lost his house. 20 other families might still be wondering where their life savings went. Emma was 17 now, a senior in high school with early admission to MIT's computer science program. The girl who'd been abandoned by her father at 14 had grown into a young woman who'd turned personal betrayal into a mission to protect vulnerable families from financial predators. Sometimes I wonder, Emma continued, if Mom somehow knew this would happen. If that's why she made sure I understood computers and math, and how to think analytically about problems. Like she was preparing me for something she couldn't protect me from herself. Margaret smiled, thinking about her daughter-in-law's fierce intelligence and her absolute dedication to preparing Emma for whatever challenges life might bring. Your mother always said you were destined for something important, sweetheart. I just don't think either of us expected it to involve putting your own father in prison. Emma laughed, and the sound was lighter than it had been in years. Yeah, that definitely wasn't on my high school guidance counselor's list of potential career paths. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, grandmother and granddaughter, survivors of family betrayal that had somehow transformed them both into something stronger than they'd been before. Outside, snow was beginning to fall in their small Vermont town, the same snow that had fallen on this house for decades, through good times and bad, through the ordinary cycles of life and loss and renewal. Margaret looked at Emma, this remarkable young woman who'd chosen justice over family loyalty, who'd protected strangers at the cost of her relationship with her father, who'd turned her own heartbreak into hope for others. I'm proud of you, Margaret said quietly. Emma smiled. I know, Grandma, and that means everything. 5 years later, Margaret Collins stood in the campus computer lab at MIT, watching her granddaughter explain cybersecurity protocols to a room full of graduate students who hung on her every word. Emma was 22 now, completing her master's degree in computer science with a specialization in digital forensics, and SafeNest Financial Watch had evolved into a nationally recognized nonprofit organization that helped recover millions of dollars for elderly fraud victims. But today's presentation wasn't about technical solutions. It was about something far more complex and infinitely more important. The most sophisticated security system in the world is useless if it's defeated by human emotion, Emma was saying, advancing to a slide that showed statistics about family-perpetrated financial abuse. Elderly fraud protection isn't really about technology. It's about understanding how criminals exploit the deepest human instincts, love, trust, and a desire to help our children succeed. Margaret watched the students take notes, saw them nodding as Emma described case studies that had become textbook examples of financial crime investigation. What struck Margaret most was how Emma had learned to talk about her father's betrayal with clinical objectivity, turning personal trauma into teachable moments that might prevent other families from experiencing the same devastation. The Collins case, Emma continued, clicking to a slide that showed a timeline of Daniel and Sophia's crimes, demonstrates how family betrayal stories often follow predictable patterns. The perpetrator typically begins by establishing themselves as a victim, struggling financially, facing desperate circumstances, needing help from family members who love them. One student raised her hand. Professor Collins, how do families recognize these patterns before it's too late? Emma smiled, and Margaret caught a glimpse of the teacher her granddaughter was becoming. The warning signs are usually there, but they're often disguised as requests for help or opportunities to invest family money. Adult children who suddenly become interested in their parents' financial affairs, who ask detailed questions about retirement accounts or insurance policies, who introduce new financial advisors who seem too good to be true. These can all be red flags. Another student asked, but what about legitimate cases where adult children really are trying to help elderly parents manage their finances? That's the cruel genius of these schemes, Emma replied. They exploit genuine family dynamics. The difference is in the transparency. Legitimate financial help involves clear documentation, official account statements, and processes that can be verified independently. Scammers always have reasons why their opportunities require secrecy or why traditional verification methods don't apply. Margaret felt a familiar mix of pride and sadness watching Emma field these questions. Her granddaughter had become an expert in financial fraud not through academic study, but through lived experience, through the particular kind of education that comes from discovering that the people you trust most in the world are capable of breathtaking betrayal. After the presentation, Margaret and Emma walked across campus together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the fall foliage that reminded Margaret of their Vermont home. Have you heard anything from him? Margaret asked quietly. It was a question she'd been avoiding for months, but Emma's upcoming graduation had brought thoughts of Daniel closer to the surface. Emma was quiet for a moment, then nodded. He sends letters sometimes, through the prison system. I don't read them anymore, but I know they arrive. Do you ever think about forgiving him? Emma finished. I think about it sometimes. Not because I miss him, but because I wonder if holding on to anger is keeping me from moving forward completely. They stopped at a bench overlooking the Charles River, where students were rowing cruise shells through water that reflected the golden light of sunset. Margaret had learned over the years to let Emma process complex emotions at her own pace, the same way she'd learned to let her granddaughter lead their family's healing journey. You know what I realized recently? Emma said, Dad's letters aren't really apologies. They're still manipulations. He writes about how prison has changed him, how he's found religion, how he dreams of making amends someday. But he never acknowledges what he actually did to the other families. He never mentions Mrs. Chun or Mr. Rodriguez or any of the other people whose lives he destroyed. Margaret wasn't surprised. Even in prison, facing the consequences of his choices, Daniel apparently couldn't accept responsibility for the full scope of his actions. I think, Emma continued, that real forgiveness requires real accountability, and Dad's never going to give me that. So instead of waiting for him to become someone he's never been, I decided to focus on building something positive from the wreckage he left behind. She pulled out her phone and showed Margaret a photo from SafeNest's latest victim recovery celebration. Dozens of elderly people and their families, standing together in a community center, holding oversized checks representing money that had been returned to them through Emma's advocacy work. That's Mrs. Patterson, Emma said, pointing to a frail woman in the front row. Remember her? She was working at a grocery store at 83 because Dad and Sophia stole her savings. Last month, we helped her recover enough money to retire with dignity. She sent me a card saying it was the first time she slept peacefully in 5 years. Margaret looked at the photo, at all those faces representing families who'd been saved from financial ruin by her granddaughter's refusal to let personal betrayal define her future. Emma hadn't just survived Daniel's abandonment. She'd transformed it into a force for protecting other people's families.